There's a version of you that was formed before you had any say in the matter, before your first relationship, before you even understood what love was. A version of you that watched how the adults around you behaved, how they handled anger, how they gave and withdrew affection, how they responded when you were scared or sad or needed something, and drew conclusions about how the world works. Those conclusions became your operating system, and most people are still running it, decades later. In relationships they can't make work, with patterns they can't explain, wondering why they keep ending up in the same place. This video is about where that comes from. Not in a vague blame your parents way, in a specific mechanistic way, because once you understand the wiring, you can actually start to change it. Here's something most people don't realise about early childhood. Your brain's primary job in the first few years of life isn't learning or developing language or being curious, it's survival. And survival for a small child means one thing above everything else: staying connected to the adults who keep you alive. Developmental psychologists call these adults your attachment figures, usually parents or primary caregivers, and your nervous system is wired from birth to monitor them constantly. Are they available? Are they responsive? If I need something, will they come? The answers your brain receives to those questions, thousands of times across thousands of interactions, become your working model of relationships. Psychologist John Bowlby, who developed attachment theory in the 1950s and 60s, described this as an internal working model, a kind of mental template your brain builds from experience, which then gets used to predict how future relationships will go. The critical thing to understand is that this template is adaptive. It's not random. Your brain isn't making mistakes. If your caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes withdrawn, your nervous system learned to stay hypervigilant, always scanning, because connection was available but unpredictable. Staying alert was the logical response. If your caregivers were consistently emotionally unavailable, not cruel, just distant, your nervous system learned to need less, to self-contain, to stop broadcasting distress signals that weren't getting answered. If your caregivers were frightening or chaotic, your nervous system faced an impossible bind. The person who's supposed to be my safe harbour is also the source of danger. That's the origin of fearful avoidant attachment, a nervous system that simultaneously craves closeness and associates it with threat. These aren't personality flaws that developed in childhood. They're solutions, adaptations that made sense given the environment. The problem is that most people carry those adaptations, unchanged, into relationships where they no longer fit. This phrase gets used a lot, but it's worth being precise about it, because the impact of emotional unavailability in childhood is often misunderstood. Most people, when they think about difficult childhoods, picture obvious dysfunction, addiction, abuse, neglect in the conventional sense. But some of the deepest attachment wounds come from environments that looked perfectly fine from the outside. Parents who were physically present but emotionally absent, who provided everything material, safety, food, stability, but who were uncomfortable with emotional expression, who changed the subject when feelings came up, who responded to distress with "you're fine" or "stop crying" or silence. Children in these environments learn something specific. Emotions are not safe to show. Needing comfort is a burden. Being vulnerable leads to disconnection, not connection. So they adapt. They learn to manage their own emotional states internally. They become self-sufficient in a way that looks, to everyone around them, like maturity and independence. But internally what's happening is suppression. The need for connection doesn't go away. It goes underground. Fast forward to adult relationships, and you have someone who genuinely struggles to let people in. Not because they're cold, but because intimacy triggers a deep, automatic response. This isn't safe. Pull back. Manage it alone. That's avoidant attachment. And it didn't start as a relationship style. It started as a coping strategy in a household where emotional needs consistently went unmet. The reverse is also true. If you had a caregiver who was loving but inconsistent, warm and engaged one day, withdrawn or preoccupied the next, with no clear pattern you could predict, your nervous system learned that love is unstable, that you have to work for it, that if something goes wrong in a relationship, you might lose it entirely. That's the root of anxious attachment, the hypervigilance, the reassurance seeking, the fear of abandonment. These aren't character weaknesses. They're the logical output of a nervous system that learned connection is scarce and precarious. One of the most uncomfortable aspects of this is how invisibly it replicates. Research consistently shows that people tend to recreate the emotional dynamics of their early relationships. Not because they want to, not because they're self-destructive, but because the familiar is neurologically easier to process than the unfamiliar. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly comparing what's happening now to what happened before and flagging deviations. A relationship that feels calm and consistent and safe, if that's not what you grew up with, can feel not just unfamiliar but wrong, boring, suspicious even. This is why people with anxious attachment sometimes feel inexplicably drawn to emotionally unavailable partners. The dynamic matches the template. The nervous system recognises it. There's a strange comfort in the familiar tension of not quite having someone, because that's what love felt like the first time around. It's also why people with avoidant attachment can struggle with partners who are secure and direct about their needs. The openness triggers the old learned response. Pull back, protect, maintain distance. A secure person's healthy expression of need can feel to an avoidant like pressure or suffocation, even when it's neither. Psychologist Harville Hendricks called this dynamic imago matching, the idea that we're unconsciously drawn to partners who give us the opportunity to work through unresolved relational wounds from childhood. The attraction isn't random, it's specific, which sounds bleak. But there's an important other side to this. Attachment theory used to be read as a kind of verdict. You got a certain attachment style in childhood, and that was essentially it. The research that followed Bowlby and Ainsworth told a more nuanced story, and the most important finding in that story is this: attachment styles are not fixed. In the 1980s and 90s, researchers studying adults began to identify a group they called earned secure, people whose early attachment experiences were difficult or disrupted, but who had developed secure attachment patterns as adults. What distinguished them? Primarily one of three things: a long-term relationship with a consistently available and attuned partner, significant therapeutic work that helped them process and integrate early experiences, or in some cases, a key relationship, a teacher, mentor, extended family member, who provided consistent, reliable care during a formative period and gave them a different model to work from. The technical term for what's happening neurologically is sometimes called updating the working model. The internal template your brain built in childhood isn't locked, it's more like a hypothesis than a law, and new consistent relational experiences over time can revise it. This is slow work. The nervous system doesn't update after a few good experiences. It needs repetition, consistency. Enough counter-evidence accumulated over time to genuinely shift the prediction. But it happens, and this is what makes the wiring framing actually hopeful rather than deterministic. The wiring can change, not through willpower or deciding to be different, through understanding the pattern clearly enough to interrupt it, and then finding or building relationships where a different kind of experience is possible. Understanding where your attachment style came from doesn't immediately change anything, but it does a few things that matter. First, it reduces shame. Most people who struggle in relationships carry some version of the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with them. They're too needy, too cold, too chaotic, too much or not enough. When you understand that these patterns are adaptive responses to specific early environments, that they made sense even if they don't serve you now, you can start to hold them differently. less as evidence of a defect, more as information about a history. Second, it creates the possibility of observation rather than just reaction. When you can recognise this panic I'm feeling right now isn't really about what just happened in this conversation. It's an old signal from a nervous system that learned to expect abandonment. You have a fraction more choice. The reaction doesn't disappear, but you're not entirely inside it. Third, it changes how you interpret your partner's behaviour. If you understand that an avoidant partner's withdrawal under stress isn't contempt or indifference, it's a learned self-protective response. You can respond to what's actually happening rather than what it feels like on the surface. None of this is straightforward in practice. Knowing the pattern and changing the pattern are very different things, but knowing it is the necessary first step. Your early experiences didn't just give you memories, they gave you a nervous system that was calibrated to those experiences, a set of predictions about what relationships are, how love works, and what to expect from other people. Most of us never question those predictions. We just live inside them and wonder why certain things keep happening. But the predictions are not the truth. They're a model built from a limited data set in conditions that no longer exist, and models can be updated. If you want to understand your own attachment style, where it came from and what it means for your relationships, I've put together a free quiz and guide. The link is in the description. Next week, we're going into something that sits right at the heart of this: anxious attachment. Specifically, why it makes you push away the exact people you most want to keep. If that sounds paradoxical, that's because the mechanism is counterintuitive, and most explanations of it get it wrong.